All right. Jake, are you ready to begin?
I am.
Great. So, again, everyone, we have Jake Jacobs here, and I also have Kay Hubbard with me as our panelist. Kay, please say hello to us.
Hello, it's nice to be with all of you.
Great. I'm really happy to see so many people from international locations. So, hello, hi, namaste, and assalamu alaikum. With this, I want to introduce Systems Thinking in Action as a young organization that has recently taken shape again. And we are in the business of organizing conferences and online webinars and courses. Jake Jacobs is a friend, colleague, and presenter at our conferences, and now he is interested in launching his RTSC course on our online platform. Other than that, we also have the Washington, D.C. conference in November that we could send you more information about. We have the online conference in August, and we have several other online courses in various organizational change techniques. With that, Jake Jacobs, I welcome you, and I would love to welcome you to begin the conversation with us.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Suraj. And as Suraj said, good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. The focus for our session now is going to be the theme of making informed decisions. So my purpose in this session is really to take you on a journey about real-time strategic change and also some practical application of it. And in doing so, help you better understand how you can gain the most value from this practicum that Suraj mentioned. So the title of the webinar, Real Work, Real Results in Real Time, the Real-Time Strategic Change Practicum. My welcome to you. I'm really delighted to be here. This is a mission for me in life and a passion, and I'm really delighted to share it with you. And my overall purpose in convening these conversations is to increase the awareness, application, and impact of real-time strategic change. The book came out 20 years ago. And so it's an opportunity to celebrate that anniversary, but also as we look at the book now, it's really about its evolution over those 20 years. A lot of work has been done, a lot of new thinking has been added, and I actually have in stages what the evolution of that has been, and we'll get into that a little bit later. One of the things that I would like to point out is that I've done a number of webinars before. And there's always been a challenge in doing webinars about what I call the polarity, which my colleagues at Polarity Partnerships and Barry Johnson, if any of you are familiar with his work, talks about these interdependent opposites. And one of them that's really important in these webinars has to do with participation and direction. And too much direction leads to monologue from me, a long speech that lasts, God forbid, 90 minutes. And there's a lot of ground to cover and many slides, and I have to rush through them, and people tend not to even finish the slides. Or participation, which is much more process focused. And I experimented with this several years ago. I held something called the silent webinar. And what it was constructed of was a series of questions, not unlike if you had a small group that you were working with or a large group, and a series of assignments. So there were long pauses where people worked on their assignments between sessions. And so what we're looking to do today is to leverage the best of both of those. How do we design something so that it's interactive for you, experiential, but also I'm able to bring some of the best thinking that I have to it. And the spirit of this is something that I learned from Siraj and the rest of the Systems Thinking in Action Temenos folks, was this concept of the word Temenos. And I'm going to take a couple minutes to describe this because it really is the spirit underlying the experience that that I hope we have this session. So Temenos is Greek for sacred container. And so when I thought about that, I did a little bit of research and went back to in Greece and Athens. This is a picture of the Acropolis. And when I looked up the definition, because I think starting to dig deeper is really what RTSC, or real-time strategic change, is about, is looking underneath the surface at the meaning and the artifacts and what meaning people make of their lives and organizations. So an acropolis is defined as a settlement built upon an area of elevated ground, and it's chosen for purposes of safety. So one of the things that I want to create in the practicum and even in this session is a feeling of great safety. The best learning is done when we can push our boundaries and go past our comfort zones, and questions that you may have, challenges, I welcome you to push back on me on some of the things that I'm saying. That's where some of the best learning is done. When I looked up sacred container and I did my Google search on it, I also saw this image, which is a ghat, which holds sacred water in India. And one of the things that they said about this is that there are curative powers in the water. And I thought that that was also a good message about real-time strategic change, that it is about, as my mentor Kathy Dannemiller used to say, bringing about greater health in the system. And so this whole notion of curative powers to me made sense as an intro as well. And then this is a picture of a lotus flower. And what is said about the lotus flower is its unfolding petals suggest the expansion of the soul. So while real-time strategic change is all about the business of the business, it is about return on investment, it's return on capital assets, it has to do with quality numbers and specifications and tolerances and all kinds of very, very concrete business-related things, and customer satisfaction numbers. All of these are part of it, but there's also a heart and soul to real-time strategic change, and it's that mixed together which is, I think, where a lot of the magic comes from. This is the Systems Thinking and Action Plus Lyceum. And the Lyceum is the name of a gymnasium in classical Athens. And again, going back into the root of these was really interesting for me, and I hope for you as well, because the Lyceum, this was something where Suraj and his colleagues set up a space on Yammer, and then they gave it this name. And I thought, this sounds like a really cool name. What it actually means. And when I went to it, there was instructions in morals and ethics that were done in these buildings, athletics, education, and informal conversations and talks and lectures. And so when I saw that, I thought, well, these are the right kind of people for me to be hanging around with, because again, there's layers and levels beyond. We're going to hold a webinar on the 24th or 25th of July, depending on where you're located. So those who heard Suraj, he is the fellow in the center at the top, and Suraj, and then Christopher Uriga is on the right, and he is the one who has supported a lot of the web development. Lorena Snodgrass is on the team, and below right, and that's Chris Clark in the center underneath Suraj, Susan Gibson, and then Jeremy Seligman. And the reason that I show you these people is also because real-time strategic change is based on the same concept of a book that I co-authored with Dick and Emily Axelrod and Julie Beaton called You Don't Have to Do It Alone, How to Involve Others to Get Things Done. And so there's always a team behind any work that's being done, and I wanted to show the faces of the people who are supporting me as we move forward. Last piece about the Temenos that I want to mention is real-time strategic change as we move further into the session is its own form of a sacred container, its own form of a Temenos, and it's all about fast and lasting change. So today we have an opportunity to create this Temenos in the session. And I say that because phone calls, emails, face-to-face interruptions, that there's a luxury for us to what I'm going to call tune in and turn off. And so I ask you to join me that, if you're in a group, in a circle, Many of you have been in that setting. If there are holes in the circle, there's sort of a leaking out of the energy and a lack of connection. And so I think that's true, even though we're working virtually, that if we can stay focused together energetically, we'll be able to hold the Temenos together as well. So this practicum is really part of a larger effort, and the larger effort includes a community of practice around real-time strategic change. And I can say in this session right now, welcome to the community of practice. By joining the webinar, you're full-fledged members. There's a very low barrier to entry, and this is all about learning and application. And there'll be tools and resources, which we'll have some of tonight and the rest throughout the practicum, and all focused on good work in the world. Whatever that may be for you, that would be for me. When we say real-time strategic change is about speed and sustainability and practical application, it's also about having things succeed. And so one of the things in my bio that I wrote for these courses is that on my epitaph, or on my tombstone at the top, I would like it to say it worked. So because real-time strategic change, we say, plays well with others, and you can combine it with any work that you're doing, and it will help accelerate and sustain the results that you achieve. We're really interested in the pragmatic application. So in today's session, we'll do some real work, and in the practicum throughout it, we'll be doing real work. This next picture here is a quote from Thomas Jefferson. And I found this for those of you who are familiar with Marv Weisbord's Productive Workplaces. And I found this in the beginning of the book, and I thought, you know, this really speaks to the spirit no safe depository, he said, of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. So at the end of a day of real-time strategic change work, my question that I ask before my head hits the pillow is, did I do a good job of helping inform discretion? Do people make wiser choices about their preferred future, what it could be, and how to get there? And then how to get there faster and have it stick over time? These are the questions that we ask from a real-time strategic change standpoint. These are the questions that matter, and this quote from Thomas Jefferson, I think, speaks to the heart of that matter. So one of the things that I wanted to do in the spirit of making and beginning this interaction with you really is we had a list of those folks who had signed up, and that helps, but you also get to know a little bit about each other as well. And I've been on this journey with real-time strategic change for 20 years. You have all been on your own journeys around change for as long as you've been in the game. And Peter Block, who is a friend and colleague and somebody that a number of you may know or know of, has a saying that you become present in group when your voice is in the room. And so although opening up the mic might be difficult in this setting, what we can do is a couple of polls and questions to get a sense of who's here. So the first poll that I'm going to ask Suraj to pull up is what role best describes your work? And I'll check and see, Suraj, whether you're pulling the poll up.
Yes, thank you so much. And I will launch the poll now and give people about 10 seconds to respond. So please take your time and respond. All right, so if you are all done, I'm closing the poll now. And Jake, if I may share the results with you.
Yep.
17% are manager or executive. 17% are internal consultants, and 67% are external consultants.
Great, great. Um, okay, and the next question then is what would you most like to learn about in this session? And if you can type your answers into the chat box, and we'll take a little bit of time, and Siraj, as they're typing them in, if you can read some of those out so we get a sense of where I should pay particular attention during the session.
Sure. Please type them in the chat box and not as questions. All right, the first comment is from Margaret, and she says, learn about how RTSC can help with change efforts. The next one is by Bruce Maybe, thank you. How RTSC differs from other large group interventions. The next one is from Stephen Bosacker, thank you. Understand the principles and dynamics of this approach to change, hopefully learn and do it. Next one is from Graham Giannini, a methodology for more effective and lasting change. John Fraser asks, how to implement RTSC into my existing business model. Joyce Reynolds says, a current update for practicing RTSC, how different from 20 years ago. Is that good for you to take off?
That's great. That's great, Siraj.
Because I have more chats and I do want to make people feel present, but I leave the
Okay,
decision to you.
let's take a few more. These are really helpful.
Okay. Wade Shows says, I'm interested in a high level overview of RTSC and how it compares to other whole system approaches. Alida Merrill, who's a regular customer of ours, welcome Alida. She says, using RTSC post merger to integrate cultures. Joanne
Hmm.
Lakomsky says, I'm looking for a learning community experience, a vacation from my day to day. And Lori
Hmm.
Dalhoff says, how do RTSC help engage reluctant colleagues in following through on system wide strategies for change? Okay, I'll stop now, and if something else comes, I'll let you know.
Great, great. Um, these are all great outcomes, and they are right on for the work that we're going to be doing. There's a in terms of the change that Margaret mentioned. This is fundamental. One of the things that we'll talk about is this notion of what I'll call continuity and transformation, and that comes from the polarity work that I've done with my colleague Barry Johnson and others. So when we talk about strategic change in RTSC, the strategic part of that change is what continues and what transforms in an organization is what the answer to strategic change is about. And so that's one piece that's actually, I think, pretty unique about this approach is that we really focus on what needs to continue and not change when you're bringing about strategic change and what needs to then shift and become part of a new reality. Um, Also, in terms of I'll speak just briefly to some of the other large group methods because real-time strategic change found its history looking back, and I can speak to that a little bit. I believe that we'll be able to look at yesterday, today, and tomorrow around RTSC. And again, this is a introductory session, so I'm going to describe a few cases and then talk about how those compare to some other approaches that I'm familiar with. So this first one at AT&T, which had to do with work that we were doing in organization that was facing a lot of competition after deregulation. And in that case, they had articles in Business Week and Fortune published on this effort to bring culture and strategy in sync in this union environment. And it was a very large organization because RTSC can be applied at that scope and scale. 10,000 people, there was a 500-person meeting, an 800-person meeting, and this was some time ago when a lot of the RTSC work was done well, you can then do RTSC work at the team or individual level as well. There's also work that was done at Home Depot, and the Home Depot work was about accelerating management development across the entire organization. So again, there was store manager, assistant store managers. This was a training application. And again, in a lot of the large group work, if you have a future search, it's particularly focused on creating the future, but you wouldn't do training in it. And in open space, again, it's about really crafting your future much more than you'd say skill development. It could be used for that, but typically not. Here, there were 2,200 locations, and the question was, how could we actually get consistency across the system? And Ian Peters, a friend and colleague of mine, did this work at Home Depot. This at TJ Maxx was a project I worked on with another friend and colleague, Jesse Stoner, and this had to do with accelerating European expansion of their stores into Poland, Germany, and the UK. And in this one, there were two larger group events of 150 people, but there were a dozen or more small meetings of 15 to 20 people where they were negotiating roles and coming up with agreements, working through conflicts. This was all part of a real-time strategic change effort. So again, when you think of large groups, you can think of the beginning of real-time strategic change, and as it's evolved, we look at what the RTSC journey is and what all the different kinds, scopes, and scale of work need to be, and that is what will move the system to greater health, going back to Kathy's quote that I mentioned earlier. At Stanley Black & Decker, this was much more focused on an executive team, and the general managers or presidents of each of the divisions were the focus of this effort, and they looked at a visioning session that involved at the beginning 60 people, but then they Peter Drucker says this, it's one of my favorite quotes of his, is that he said that strategy doesn't count for anything unless it, and this is his quote, degenerates into work. And so that whole notion of degenerating into the work, RTSC is all about the specifics, the details of daily work. And so this work at Stanley Black & Decker started with a visioning session, but ended up being about very basic business practices. And this is a good example. This is Ann Arbor Transit. And obviously you can see it's a bus company. 300 employees in this organization. And I worked with them on two different settings. One was a 10-year strategic planning effort, and Kay Hubbard, who's with us today, also worked on that with me. And this engaged an entire population, their customers, community members, board members, and one of the things that we had, they had scenario planning. So they had a number of different variables. It was actually a pretty complicated question that they were asking that said, well, what service would they provide? And there were a number of different forms of service, buses or vans or different modes. So what would they provide? Where would they provide it, location-wise, and when would they provide it in terms of the times? So as you think about that, there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of possibilities, and we were trying to convey how can we get this clear to the drivers and the mechanics and the finance people. And one of the mechanics in our planning team, because design teams are a central part of RTSC as well. These are microcosms or cross-sections of the organization or the group that you're going to be working with, helps plan the session itself. And one of the mechanics looked up when we were trying to explain this, and it was really important to get this clear, and it wasn't clear how to make that happen. And one of the mechanics looked up and he said, oh, it's like Mr. Potato Head. Now, for folks in different parts of the world, they don't know how familiar Mr. Potato Head will be. For those of us in the States, most children played with it. But if you can imagine a toy that actually is a potato, and then you can put different eyes, different mouth, different ears, different hat on it, and switch them around and make a different face each time. And so this guy was going back to his childhood and said, well, these variables that you're talking about, they're just ears, eyes, noses, and mouths, and we can switch them around. And so that clicked for people, and they got this very complicated concept of scenario planning, and they were able to pull it together. And we actually had, for gender bias, we had Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head session, but they came through and did a lot of very sophisticated work in an arena that was not their normal way of working. But again, it was important for people's voices to be heard, and that was one of the ways we did it at Ann Arbor Transit. And then finally, the last story here is around Adam Street Publishing, which publishes these 5, and now they've added a 6th alternative newspaper. This is a very small organization. There's only 22 people in it. So when you think of RTSC and you think of these large groups, I also invite you to think of the 22 people at Adam Street Publishing. And we did work with them around their vision and values, not unlike what we had done in very large organizations at Ford or American Express or others early in RTSC's evolution. And just recently had the entire staff work through feedback on those values, and we got a representative from each of the departments, and they met and worked through what it was that they we're going to revise about the vision and values. And I'll just point out one thing that they came up with. This is fresh in my mind, but the original version of it said to highlight the good things happening in our communities, which is noble. It's a good thing. When the subgroup met, they changed that to be an active, positive contributor in our communities. And there's only a few words different there, but the difference between highlighting, which is like an observer role, it's noticing, and they're newspapers, so they could settle for that. It would be good enough to be a highlighter of good things. But they said, no, we want to ratchet that up. We'd like to be active contributors to a positive community. And so even at that notion of, well, whose voice needs to be heard, who are the key stakeholders, that part of that is around engagement and commitment. The other part of it is it's really about improving the quality of the work that's being done. And in this case, that's a very concrete example of something that we just recently worked on. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is just briefly the history and evolution. People on this picture, but just as a representative sample, you can see that in the center at the top is Kurt Levine, and in the 40s he did a lot of work with group dynamics, and you may have known him as Kurt Lewin, but in Germany where he was living they pronounced it Levine. He was a mentor to Ron Lippert, who's on the right. Ron did work at the University of Michigan, and with Eva Schindler-Rainman, the woman below him, they did work in the 60s and the 70s around communities and creating collaborative communities. And they had very large group meetings in 80-plus communities around the world, which is where the first large group work was done. One of the best stories about that, I think, is that in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is a small town outside Detroit, they had the future of Ypsilanti, and in that there were hundreds of people there, and a number of businessmen and government officials, and they also invited everybody in the city. So one of the people there was a small child. I think he was about 8 years old or so, and everybody talked about what they wanted to create for the future, and he said he wanted bike paths. So everybody thought that was, a good idea, and then they went on with their grand plans about the conference center and other things that they were planning to do. The first thing that actually got implemented out of that entire event and all of that work, bike paths. So if that child had not gone to that session, the bike paths wouldn't probably have ended up in Ypsilanti, or they certainly would have ended up there as soon as they had. Dick Beckhard is in the center underneath Kurt Levine, and Dick Beckhard did work in the 80s again around very large groups, and he was one of the predecessors then to the work that Kathy, Chuck Tyson, Al Davenport, Bruce Gibb, and then Nancy Bedore did at Ford in the mid to late 80s and into the 90s. The bottom left is a picture of Russ Akoff, and Russ Akoff is a systems thinker and would be known to the systems thinking and action community. One of the things that I like that Russ Akoff coined, he looked and he called an interconnected set of problems. He had a very specific name for it. He called it a mess. And so this whole notion of interconnected sets of problems, when you take an RTSC worldview, you want to get your hands around as much of the messy reality as possible. So rather than cutting a problem down to size, even the scoping work in RTSC is called scoping possibilities. So it's always about looking at the next level out or the next 2 or 3 levels out. When we go to engage people in an RTSC effort, we may say who might be the key stakeholders, and the design team will identify people. And then we go ask those people who might be key stakeholders, and then out from those people again who might else be involved in this effort for it to be successful. And then the Marv Weiss board is in the upper left, and Marv is of a different generation than these folks, but also has done a lot in productive workplaces to tell the story of the field. And I had sent him a note asking him to, put the good word out about this webinar in the practicum, and I got a note back from him a few days ago, and he basically said it's a great thing that you continue to push your thinking on this, and the work in future search is something that we continue to push forward. So from, again, a play well with others standpoint, there have been RTSC efforts that have also included future searches within them or future search concepts within RTSC events. So this is a little on the history then of RTSC itself. If you think of a first generation, this was done in large groups, and this is very typical, groups of 8 people here, and they would be either sitting around a table or in a circle and working interactively. And I myself has worked with 1,000 people on the floor of the New Orleans Superdome with interactive working session for 3 days and in deciding on 10 actions to save their business. And this was with an organization, Mobil's Gulf of Mexico business unit. And in that, because they had 1,000 of 1,200 people in the organization literally on the floor of this arena, and making the decisions that they agreed to, the implementation was automatic. That with reluctant colleagues. And the real-time strategic change answer to that is welcome them with open arms. So often people get seen to be troublemakers, or they're not on board, or they're not bought into the process. There are all kinds of words and language that get used in organizations around this. And from an RTSC standpoint, the troublemakers, we wrote in this book, You Don't Have to Do It Alone, troublemaking is in the eye of the beholder. So to the extent to which I have you be a troublemaker, you tend to behave like one. And if you're a reluctant colleague and I treat you as a reluctant colleague, you're more likely to behave as one. From an RTSC standpoint, these people who see the world differently than us actually are watching our back. They are bringing information to the table. They're seeing things that aren't on our radar. And so rather than sort of pushing against them, what we do is we pull them in. We draw circles that include them. And I'll say at this point that the whole notion of buy-in is not an RTSC concept. It doesn't make sense from an RTSC worldview. And the reason is because to have buy-in, you have to have a seller. There's a seller and a buyer. And in the world of real-time strategic change, we're not selling anything to anybody. People are making informed decisions, back to Thomas Jefferson, about how to create their collective future. Now, in this large group work, there was Kathy, that's Kathy Dannemiller in the center, and she had what I called aphorisms. There were a lot of wise sayings that she used. What is the purpose? It's the North Star. All RTSC work has a clear purpose and outcomes. Celebrate diversity. Build a common database was one that is an aphorism. It started with Kathy, and you can see it coming all the way through to the principles we use today. These were 50 aphorisms. When I wrote the RTSC book, I literally sat down with small Post-it notes and wrote down all of these wise sayings, started to group them together and see how they fit. And if you read the first 3 chapters of the Real-Time Strategic Change book, you'll see these 20 principles. Now, one of them, if you look at the center here, it says all activities add to the common database we're creating together. Now, this looks a lot like this whole notion that Kathy mentioned about build a common database. So from those 20 principles, the next evolution was to look and say, Frank McEwen, a colleague of mine, and I were going out to do a training session after the book came out. And there were these 20 principles, and as the story goes, we were getting ready for the training, and we said, well, there's 20 principles. God had 10 commandments. God throws around a lot more weight than we do, so we better find a way to get these under 10. And what we did is we came up with these 6, which in fact are the core and focus of the work today. Changed some and evolved some from then, and I'll describe where they are today. But again, the shift of principles opened the door to beyond the event-only game. That in fact, once we had principles, you could apply it to any work, whether it was the launch of a team, whether it was individual coaching. All of these things shifted when you get into the world of principles, because those principles are held fast, and then there's great flexibility in how you apply them. And then most recently, this whole notion about looking at daily work, and daily work saying, what is it on every day you can open your calendar and you can do good real-time strategic change work by focusing on these principles. And then we moved into work with Barry, and that's Barry Johnson, if you haven't seen or met him. And Barry has done work around polarities. And the polarities are these interdependent opposites that need each other over time. So when we look at this common understanding principle, which again goes back to the first one that I talked about with common database with Kathy, we look at it and we say, well, you get informed decisions by looking at diverse perspectives and shared meaning. Suraj, I want to check, are you hearing an echo or no?
Yes, I'm hearing an echo from you.
Okay. And if maybe all the other speakers could get turned off, I think we were good. Let's see how we do. So this informed decision is really about diverse perspectives and shared meaning. So the common here is really looking at the difference and the commonality, and that was another evolution to look at the principles as defined as polarities. And they also then open the door to any and all change work. So that's where this invitation comes from, to say anything that you're doing, any work that you're doing in an organization or with an individual, we can take these principles, apply them, and accelerate and sustain whatever those results are. So this has been a really exciting journey for me over the last 20 years, and a lot has evolved and changed over time. So those large group meetings, they're still very useful, beneficial, and available, and they're not the only option. Now, the real-time strategic change mantras, I put this in, and it's actually going to be a session itself within the practicum, because the way that we see the world has a lot to do with the world that we see. And so this notion of mantras has to do with ways that we make sense of the world. And I've got just a few of them here as examples. Now, this speaks to the troublemaker story that I was telling earlier. We fired all the troublemakers 6 months ago, around the time this company generated its last original idea. So a lot of times, these troublemakers do think differently than us. I had a client once who it was a union environment, and for a number of different reasons, the union had not been invited early enough into the process. And so when a committee person joined the design team, this microcosm of the organization, Joe was his name, and he stood in the doorway for the first day of the design team meeting with his arms crossed. So you can imagine, we weren't doing very good on the engagement and inclusion principle at that point, but he stood there. Now, there were people who looked and said, well, he's not playing the game with the rest of us. He's not on board. All of these things that, looked and said there was something wrong with Joe. And of course, I looked at Joe and I said, good reason that he's standing. There was something that got mixed up. He didn't get invited. It doesn't matter how good the intentions were. The impact on him was he was late to the party. And as it turned out, over time, your greatest cynics often become your best zealots in a real-time strategic change effort. The question about what is it that this person can add, and then we ask them what the issues are, rather than trying to get around, through, over, or under the resistance. We open it, like I said, with arms, and we say more, is one of the most powerful approaches in real-time strategic change. When somebody has an issue, the first thing we do is we say, could you say more? This picture with a lot of arrows speaks to a mantra around something that I learned from Myron Rogers, which is start anywhere, be willing to go everywhere. And so a lot of change efforts, methodologies, and approaches say you must start at the top. You need to have a guiding coalition. This CEO needs to lead the change effort. And from an RTSC standpoint, I would be the first to tell you it's a lot easier going down that path. And every textbook would tell you that's true. I would also say, in my experience, reality does not always follow the textbooks. We work to achieve that level of commitment and alignment, and find a way in and work from there. And the flexibility of RTSC comes in really handy here. That story of AT&T that ended up in Fortune and Businessweek magazines, it started with a much humbler origin. Faye Kandarian called. She was working at this company, and she's another friend and colleague, and she called and she said, could you come to help facilitate a one-day problem-solving session for 30 people? And I listened to her and I asked her a few questions, and there are 10,000 people in the company. They just had some layoffs, and the question became, what is 30 people in a problem-solving session going to do for the 10,000? And at some level, logically, you can say not much. And from an RTSC standpoint, we look and we say, well, what might be? Will it be better for our having been there? And the answer to that is yes. So when I showed up there the night before, we had dinner with the leaders of this organization. They said, we heard you work with big groups and you're not happy with 30 people. So I said, well, I'm not sure that having 30 people meet is really going to help you achieve your objectives. That's my concern. The next day, 80 people were there. Was that enough? No, not on its own. But at the end of the session, and we have a video of Dan Melio, who is the CEO, walking up to the podium, and you can see him mouthing the word, wow. And what happened was he realized what collaborative processes could do, what the possibility was, and the potential in his organization. And what that led to was a 2-year effort. And there were a couple of those large group meetings as part of it, and a lot of other work with the leadership team and with task forces that got launched. But they actually had those articles written up starting with a 30-person problem solving meeting that most people, right, reading Flawless Consulting from Peter Block or other consulting books, would have told you, run the other way as fast as you can. This is certainly not going to be successful. So at this point, there's one other mantra I want to get to, and then Suraj, let's pause and see if there's some questions that people have. This one is, these geese that are flying in formation is really about leadership and followership. And so one of the notions of this formation is that they take turns. They take turns being in the headwinds and then fly back to the pack where they can get in the slipstream of the other birds. And so when we look at leadership in an RTSC effort, we ask the question, who are the leaders that we need for this effort to succeed? And oftentimes it'll be hierarchical leaders. Roles, and it's much more of both a structured process of getting hierarchical leaders and an organic process of figuring out who needs to provide leadership in addition to those folks for an effort of real-time strategic change to succeed. So my question at this point is, maybe we pause, Suraj, and see if there are other questions that people have before we move on to the next stage, which is around when and where to apply real-time strategic change.
Great. I have two questions for you right now. One is from Joyce Reynolds, and she asks, how are you using RTSC virtually?
Good. Let me speak to that one, and then Suraj will see what other ones you have. Yeah.
Got it.
So there are a couple ways, Joyce, that I would answer that in terms of using RTSC virtually, because it really is the world that we live in today. One of them, which I'm not sure was the question that you're asking, but I think it's a good example that I want to point to, is I had this client in Ann Arbor, which is in Michigan, which is about 2,000 miles from Los Angeles where I was living. And over the course of 12 months, I made 4 trips to Ann Arbor, Michigan from Los Angeles, and the rest of it was all done virtually. So this notion of I was actually facilitating meetings 3 and 4 times a week, we all did it over Skype. And I know that you're probably asking about non-co-located teams, but I want to point out that, again, that this whole notion of the world getting smaller and how can we do this work? I mean, this was teams working on meeting processes, on prioritization practices. I mean, these were down at the level of where the work gets done every day. And again, it was something that I was able to do remotely, which I think opens up the possibilities for what it may be that the kind of work that we can be doing, and also, of course, with greenhouse gases, what is it that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint? Well, this was one example just from a consulting standpoint. Now, in terms of the virtual work with non-co-located teams, there's work that we've done a little of with Maestro conferencing, and that's something that I'm really excited about the possibilities of. And it's set up similar to a large group meeting with breakouts and ways that you can structure conversations. Jeremy Grandstaff, who's part of Nexus for Change, which is another partner in promoting this effort, has done work, and it's been a number of non-co-located teams. That there's conferences that they have that are same time, different place. I also think that the work that Suraj is doing this summer, and I would strongly endorse this series of sessions in August, is a different time, different place experience. So because those RTSC principles are broadly applicable you can take them and attach them to any work that you're doing. So the whole notion of what does it look like to work virtually, there are a lot of different technologies that get used. From an RTSC standpoint, we would say, how can we apply those principles in a way to turbocharge the work that's already being done?
Thanks. Jake, we'd like you to go through the RTSC principles and any practices, and if you can use them in the context of some solid example, I think that'll be really helpful.
Great, great. This is just a couple things about where you can use it. This is often, this is obviously Russ Acuff's mess, and you can look at it and say, when things aren't clear, it's readily available. Large or small projects as well, it can work on. And then when things are very clear, this is an overall project plan and a Gantt chart. So there's like this soft and hard side to RTSC. I'm going to move to the principles, which is where we are with these today. And I'll tell the story of the principles through a client example. So here we have the 6 principles, and they are defined as polarities at this point, and the darker rectangles at the top are greater purpose statements, or what is it that you'll get when you do making reality a key driver. When you work that principle well, you inform decisions and actions. And this is done by knowing the inside and the outside of the organization. So what did this look like? Let me pick one of the examples that I think would make sense here. We did this work at TJ Maxx around accelerating the implementation of their work in Europe and their stores. So knowing the inside of their organization had to do with the fundamental business practices, processes, the roles, the responsibilities. So there was a deep look inside at the culture, and the way that people had been working was a fundamental aspect of what was being done. And the outside of their organization included not just competitive studies and the industry, but they also looked out beyond their industry and said, they took lessons from, say, the automotive industry, and looking and saying, well, what is it that we can learn about throughput to be able to take our operations and get the clothing from concept to customer? And so that informed a lot of the work and how it was done. When we talk about engaging and including, I said earlier, it's both about better answers and more commitment. And from an RTSC standpoint, clear direction and broad-based participation are both important. A lot of people early on said, well, you're dealing with engaging and including, so you must be the participation guy. That's what RTSC must be about. And sometimes it is. And sometimes it's getting very clear direction. So in this case, the strategy, there was a grow fast strategy and a flow fast process that they wanted to implement. These were not negotiable. There were a lot of items on that list that were like, this is what it's going to be. The CEO, the senior team decided, and that level of clarity actually paradoxically made it much easier to participate. And so there was participation with very clear boundaries. How this was going to get implemented, when, where, what requirements there were going to be for different people, the new skills and abilities and knowledge that need to be developed. All of that is where participation played. But the locked-in strategy was something that was clearly directive. As I'm going around this, if folks are seeing that this is the level of detail and sort of tying it to work, if you can type into the chat box, or if you have additional questions, I'll move around the rest of the principles and then we'll touch base. So preferred futuring is about the best of your past and present and compelling possibilities for the future. So this comes from Ron Lippitt, and the idea was, most people, when they look at future and they talk about vision, and they sort of, you forget about the present as much, and this appreciative inquiry piece is something that RTSC makes sure doesn't get lost. So one of the things that they focused on in TJ Maxx was their history and the culture and the commitment they had to off-price retailing. So what could we do at a cost advantage for our customer? And that's something that they wanted to hold on to. The possibilities for the future had to do with what they could do to bring in new styles and new suppliers in a way that was rapid and successful. And bringing new people on board as they grew the business, they needed to grow all of these relationships very quickly in Europe. So again, both of those factored into the work. And then when we look at creating community, we talk about what are the process systems and structures, but also what are the people. So there's sort of that hard side and soft side to it. And we talk about creating community as the principle, as the soul of RTSC. And so there was a lot of time spent in dialogue and conversation about who we are now. Who is it that is TJ Maxx in Europe, and how can we hold on to these aspects of the culture which are so important, and also put in new process systems and structures that make us successful in this rapid growth period. Thinking and acting in real time was one of the, I think it's the most unique principle. And this one we talk about plan for your future and be in your future now. And how this showed up at TJ Maxx was there were, I'll give you a very concrete example, which was in a leadership team meeting, they were having a debate and a dialogue that involved one of the divisions, and within one of the divisions, one of the departments. And so there was all of this conversation, and they had said, we need to work better cross-functionally, and we need to get communication flows moving. I mean, all the good things that make organizations successful. In that meeting, we stopped and we said, if we were in our preferred future, how would we be having this discussion? And there was this pause, because you get into these debates and they get heated and people get excited and there's a lot of energy. And we stepped back and said, well, wait a minute, how do we say we want to do business in the future? And they came back with all of this collaboration and communication and things. And so they said, well, wait a minute, these 4 people would be in the conversation. I mean, their information is necessary, and they would help sort this out for us. So I said, all right, well, how can we get a hold of those people? Well, they only got a hold of 3 out of the 4, but 3 was a lot better than none. And so this notion of immediacy, they literally stopped their meeting, took a break, found these people wherever they were, got them on the phone, got them into the room, got their voices really what real time is about, is any piece of that future that you bring into the present, it becomes a better way of doing business. And when you look left, you look right, things are changing because there are these short learning loops. It's about any change that you can make today that moves us toward our preferred future, and it shrinks the cycle time between planning and implementation. And then building understanding. Remember that common database principle and aphorism that came from Kathy? This is then how we learn and develop in RTSC. It's about inquiry about others, so there's an inquiry, and advocacy. Advocate for what you believe. Now, they launched a European Learning Center as part of this effort. And in the launching of that, they had all kinds of courses that were developed that were about learning for the future. And this learning was built on a concept, a fundamental underpinning of it was, what can we be curious about learning? And that came from the learner standpoint, but also, what is the curriculum? What is it that's fixed and focused around the advocating that the business said, these things are important, this is what we need to develop competencies in, but also a collaborative process to fill out that curriculum around what it was that people wanted and believed they needed. So that's a trip around the principles. I want to check in and see where people are with that. And again, there's an entire session in the practicum on the principles. This is the introduction, and so we just spend a little bit of time on them.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Is it possible for you to go through these principles and apply RTSC in confrontational situations?
Absolutely. And because they play well with others, there may be approaches that the organization typically uses to conflict. And from years ago, getting to yes, which I think is still very solid work that's out of Harvard. There are other approaches to conflict. Even appreciative inquiry may be a way to look at conflict. But the principles inform thinking and action. And so whether it's in a conflict situation, whether it's in a collaborative creation of the future, whether it's in a launching of a new project team, managing a project over time, all of these principles help guide thought and action. So just as I walked around those principles, looking at the TJ Maxx story, in the practicum, what we'll do is people will choose projects to work on, and multiple projects, because it's 12 sessions. So you'll be able to work on multiple projects over the course of those 3 months, and we'll be able to take those principles and apply them to any work that you're doing, whether it's around conflict or collaboration or anything else.
Great. Thanks a lot. That's all. I don't have any more questions.
All right, great. So here we're going to just take a quick walkthrough what I'm calling the real-time immediate difference maker tool. So there's a PDF of this that you'll get in a Dropbox link. But if you can take the pencil and do a little work around this as I ask these questions. First, identify a situation you want to test drive with the principal. And what I'm going to do is read through these instructions, and then I'll give you an example of when I did it and ask you to follow along and jot some notes down yourself. So first, we want to find a situation. Then brainstorm a list of, so what does better look like? This is this preferred future notion. Then I'm going to ask you to put a check mark next to the items on the list which you have some control or influence to make it happen. And then review the rest of the list, identify any items that if you shifted the language, if you reframed them in some way, that you would have control over it, and then pick one that you can implement in some way, either immediately or in the very near future. And then I'm going to ask you to, if we were to take it seriously, what kind of support and accountability partner could help us succeed? And when and how would you recruit them, and what would you do to gain their support? And then there's a debrief piece of this assignment as well. So you can jot some notes now, and then there'll be this tool that you can use that'll be downloadable as well. So as I'm telling the story here, I'd invite you to go through and jot some notes down. So this was my situation. Was a sub-team of leaders chartered with leading this effort. So that was my situation, and I'd ask you jot a couple notes down about something that you're working on right now that we can use for this real-time principle. Then there was brainstorm a list of descriptions. So what would better look like? And I came up with a half dozen bullet points here. Leaders throughout the organization translating the strategy into their daily work. My client, who was the head of HR, leading a conversation with her colleagues in the senior team. Strategy significantly more visible throughout the organization. A reward system would be great if we had that in line. Celebration, they call them line of sight strategy actions, that were actions taken that you could see were linked to the strategy. And the leadership team themselves becoming more engaged and being accountable. But if you look through this list, there are a lot of them that aren't in my direct influence or control. I mean, I'm not going to be able to help make a reward system happen in the near term. Strategy significantly more visible throughout the organization. I was working at the senior level within the HR organization, but to have that happen in every plant and facility in the organization, these were things outside my control. So when I looked at this list, I put a check mark next to the item which I had control or influence over. It was pretty much boiled down to one of those, my client leading conversations with her colleagues. I met with her once a week, and I could support her. She had authority in the conversations with her colleagues. So as you put a list of what better would look like, I'd ask you put a check mark against ones that you think I could have a say about this, I could make a difference. Then we review the list and see, can we shift the language? Are some of them good ideas, but they just need a little revision to make them work better? So I looked at and I said, yep, that she could lead the conversation. But rather than the leadership team, you see here we have the leadership team being more accountable for the strategy. That last item, I shifted it and I said, well, my client team up, and the sub team could become more engaged and being accountable. So again, this is a scoping possibilities. It's looking at where might there be points of leverage. In an RTSC effort, we actually try and find the greatest leverage. What's the least we could do with the greatest benefit? Because resources are tight always. And so the question is, where are there opportunities for us to make a big difference? And here, these are all conversation oriented. They don't cost money. They are investments of time and energy. So as you think of your list, go through and see, are there any that you'd say, I could shift this a little bit and open up a door of possibilities or a window of possibilities here? Now, pick one you can implement in some way immediately or in the very near future. So what I looked at in my situation was I said, well, we want to change the conversation around accountability. And on a sub-team agenda for the Wednesday meeting, right? So this was a couple days into the future with a 24-hour turnaround getting ready for it. We said, let's change the agenda for the sub-team and actually not make it about how they can help the rest of the organization implement this. How can they help themselves implement it? And that's a question that everybody could get their arms around. The other thing that happened was my client said, let's include this conversation on all the agendas for the meetings in HR and actually put together a structured experience that her leaders could take out into the organization to engage people in the strategy dialogue. And not just here's what the strategy is, but here's what it is. What do you think? What can we do in our part of the organization around it? And then how can we feed that back in? And that started a whole process in the company, really, of different parts of the organization engaging in these conversations. So they became a core keystone habit that got shifted in the organization around what the future could look like and what our role was in creating it. So sit back and take a look at a list that you've jotted down there and pick one and see what could you do that would more immediately or in the very near future be an action that you could take that would make a difference. And then an accountability and support partner. So this is another polarity, and what's really important about it is that we look and say it's about both support, so somebody can help you, but also accountability, because I'm going to have to report to this person what I've done. And what I had, Becky Bruns was a colleague of mine. She invited me into this work, and I had said by Monday of that week, I needed to email her ahead of time and schedule a 30-minute call and implement it with Susan during our you can. It's not an enormous ask to have Susan shift that agenda, but the dynamics of shifting that conversation ended up being quite profound in the organization. So who could you reach out to as a support and accountability partner that could say, yeah, what is it that you'd need from this person? How could they help you? And when could you report back to them on the work that you've done, or how could they even partner with you in doing that work? And then finally, there's this debrief and reflect with your support and accountability partner about what you actually did, what was accomplished, and what did you learn. And in the template, there's two things. One is around actions. So at the action level, one of the things that I can see in my own story was I followed through as I committed. I mean, I did what I said I was going to do. I also had a call with Susan that led to listing all the ways she could begin further implementing the strategy. So it started her thinking differently about it. Rather than leading an effort to implement the strategy, she was working on implementing the strategy as a leader of the effort. Little different language, but much different in terms of her work. And then finally, we drafted the purpose and outcomes of this. We called it a meeting in a box, which was this experiential 2.5 hour meeting that she created along with a team from her organization, another microcosm and design team, to engage people throughout the human resources function in creating input to this strategy and implementing the strategy itself. And then finally, there's another side of this. One is action and one is learning. And so what is it with your support and accountability partner might you look at in learning? And this would be something that you'd plan for the future. One of my insights was, when I plan, I implement. Another one, things can move faster than I thought. So in terms of being able to get traction, this is something that we could do within a 24-hour window. And finally, clarity on my part leads to clarity on the part of my clients or those people I'm working with. So this is another one of those things where there's a go slow to go fast. Stepping back and looking at the possibilities led us to a few clear statements and actions that then had a tremendously positive ripple effect in the organization. And then lastly, I think, was make change work daily work and daily work change work. So this notion of change work's done on Fridays in a task force isn't part of RTSC. We really look and say, what is the work that gets done on a daily basis, and how can we connect that to doing business in better ways? And when we're doing business in better ways, how can we embed that as part of the daily work of the organization? So here's my request. When you get these PDFs and you download them and you're able to fill them in, I've got a request and an offer for you. If you can put in the subject line to my email, and again, that's jake@polaritypartnerships.com, and email me with the subject line of the RTSC practicum, a bullet point or two about the situation, what action you took, what impact it had, and then any questions that you have. And my commitment to you is that depending on your request, I will either email back responses, or if you put a phone number in and you say, I'd like to have a conversation with you about this, I will call you back within a week. We'll schedule a time and we'll talk about the questions you had in doing this application. So when I'm really serious about me being an accountability and support partner for you, as well as those that you may choose on your own. And that personal response will come directly from me. Now, Kay Hubbard has joined us to talk about integrating RTSC with existing work and approaches. And when you think of this, this is a strand of DNA between your current practice and RTSC and how those weave together. And I asked Kay to join us to tell us a story about how she actually has done this in her practice. Kay?
Hi. Thanks, Jake, very much. I'm getting a little echo here. I hope other people aren't as well. But I had a very, very interesting experience with RTSC actually being a plays well with others effort in terms of I did a lot of organizational development work. I was inside an organization for 22 years. It was recognized as one of the best companies to work for in America. And then I started doing consulting, and I found that often I was working with other. I'm having a terrible feedback here, so I'm sorry about that. Oh, much better. Thank you. I hope you can still hear me. But I had a lot of experience with trying to go in and help people manage other people, but they often had other things that they were working on. For example, they were doing a lot of work with total quality, or they were doing a lot of work with lean manufacturing, or they were doing something with, you know, fish culture or whatever. And what RTSC really helped me understand was that we could work together, that we didn't have to work in opposition with all those efforts. We could try to figure out and describe a larger playground where we could all work together to get the same things done for the company. And I had a lot of very, very positive successes working with companies, and one of them was in particular interesting to me. I was working with a company in Kentucky. It was a manufacturing company, and I was working with somebody who I'd worked with before as an internal consultant, and we did fabulous work, such good work in terms of describing their preferred future and moving toward it rapidly and strategically, that the corporation said that every single division in the company nationally had to do this, something like this, and they had a choice between us, the clients that were the consultants that were working with the client in Kentucky, or they had a group that they were using, a very high-powered consulting firm that they were going to use, and we were chosen by a division in Canada to do their change effort. And the main reason they chose us was that we weren't the corporate team, that they didn't want to deal with corporate at all, so they wanted to deal with us as possible. And it was enormously complicated because it was a manufacturing company. 1/3 of the company basically spoke English. Another third of the company spoke Vietnamese, and another third of the company spoke Spanish as a first language. So anything that we were going to do in this project had to deal with 3 different languages and 3 different approaches, and a huge resistance from a lot of people on the leadership team saying, you can't possibly engage people in this. Oh my God, what are they going to ask us to do? And I'll never forget the first meeting with the executive team when they said, oh my gosh, they're going to ask us to get microwaves in the lunchroom, and thinking, yes, if you're lucky, they'll ask you to get microwaves in the lunchroom. So very interesting approach. And I partnered with Ian Peters, who actually was an RTSC client, and he lived in California. And because we knew right away we were going to need somebody on the ground to work with this project and to make sure that we could get it done. And we did. We set up a design team that had people who were multilingual. So there were at least 1/3 of the design team could speak English and Spanish. 1/3 of the design team could speak Vietnamese and Spanish. And usually there was some familiarity in some ways with all of it. We translated all of the materials that we had for the entire effort into 3 different languages, and we had translators at all the breakout tables. So when we started looking at the principles of RTSC, it was just fabulous, because everything that everybody else said, well, you won't be able to do this, we decided that that made us get better. That one of the things we found out was, if you have to deal with all these languages, you have to have a very clear message. You have to be extremely prepared before you go out with the materials. And we were able to take these principles and just push this past anybody's expectations in terms of what we're able to do. I love it. I still have pictures of people coming up afterwards and taking pictures of their preferred future, which they had drawn together. We did a lot of the interactive work in pictures as opposed to language and report outs and that kind of stuff. But we kept all of it forward in terms of exactly focusing on the principles all the time. Every single obstacle was viewed as an opportunity, and it really completely blew all of us away that we were able to accomplish the kind of things that we were able to accomplish. And we got the CEO of the division got a standing ovation at the end. And here, this is a man not inclined toward tears, but he got there watching what happened with it. It was absolutely stunning. And we took all of the things that people said couldn't be done and actually used the principles to help us figure out a way to make those advantages for us. So anybody have any questions for me or something that I can do with it? I hope you can hear me decently, and we can that you could. I am happy to describe anything that we're doing that we
Th-
did.
Thanks a lot, Kay. I had muted Jake and now I've unmuted him because there was a bad echo earlier. I don't have any questions for you actually, but I
Okay,
imagine you and Jake could have a dialogue.
that's great. That's good, and you can mute me if you're keeping if you get when you put Jake back on. If you get a echo, that's probably coming from my system here. So mute me, and I can send him messages.
Great. Jake, you're on now.
Great. Here's what I suggest we do. Let's double back with the time that we'll have left with open questions for Kay or for me about her story or any of the material that I covered, and take a look at the practicum itself, because I'd like people, part of informed discretion and informed decisions is to have a sense of what we're going to be doing. And so in the very first session, we're really talking about how to hit the ground running with your project. And so for each of the sessions, we're going to make sure that there's prep work ahead of time. And a questionnaire will go out that'll get you ready for the work that we're going to be doing. And that's that first session will kick us off. I said that we'd be doing a session on the mantras themselves. And so that's going to be the second session. Again, how do we start thinking differently about the work so that we can start doing differently about the work? And then as people had an interest in the principles, there's going to be an entire session set aside for dealing with the RTSC principles, each of them, how to apply them, how they can work for you, and what they mean and where they came from. All of the detail around the principles will be the third session. The fourth session is an aspect that I've mentioned around scoping possibilities. And so this is one of the three areas of work in RTSC, is scoping what the possibilities might be for the project that you're working on and for the outcomes and results that you'd like to, and your clients and other stakeholders would like to achieve. Then engaging stakeholders. So this going back to the you don't have to do it alone book. Who are all the different kinds of stakeholders? How can you creatively engage these people? How can you ask them to participate in a way that they will want to join the effort? Those are all the kinds of questions we'll deal with in session 5. In session 6, we talk about developing and aligning leadership. So this whole notion of who needs to provide leadership, there's a session that we'll spend both in aligning leadership, but also what are the new skills and abilities they'll need. Session 7 is around what we in RTSC call creating system-wide congruence. And congruence is it's a step or two beyond just alignment, but how do we make sure that all of the process, systems, structures, culture, knowledge, skills, abilities, all of these things fit together in whatever work you're doing to help make it accelerated and sustainable. In session 8, there's actually an assessment we have now, a polarity-based assessment on the RTSC principles. And you'll be able to get the instructions for this and the training in this, all of that will be in session 8. So you can go out, if we believe these principles are useful, the question becomes, how can we leverage them and leverage them in ways that get us more energy working for us in the organization instead of against us. And that's what session 9 is going to be, is an opportunity for you to go back and prep for going to your project team or teams, depending on what you decide to do with the practicum, and learning from the assessment. And then session 10, embedding better ways of doing business in daily work, is really about taking this. Remember we said it got to the point of how do we make change work daily work and daily work change work. And then session 11 is about how do we translate this into your own practice, whether you're a manager, a leader, an internal, external consultant, a trainer. What does it mean to take this work and put it into your own practice? And then finally, the last session is on celebration and future work. What other possibilities are there for you to be able to fully leverage this opportunity and what you've learned? So this is something that will come out as well, and I want to explain it, but it's going to be in that Dropbox so that you can think through how to make a good decision around whether this practicum is a good idea for you. So Describe your project. And here's a few things that we're going to ask as suggestions for you. So who are the stakeholders? And what stake do they have? So you start to scope this project out in a piece of work that you think you could bring into the practicum. What's your role and what relationships do you have with these different people and the relationships? Whose ear do you have? Who's been challenging? Get a sense of what this project looks like. And often just answering these questions leads to some insights. And then after we get a description of the project, what does success look like? So I encourage you, be greedy. What would success look like in your project for both the stakeholders that you have, but also you? You're one of the stakeholders, so what does success look like for you in this? And this will all be in the downloadable PDF that you can type straight into. And then you got to assess the practicum's value against that. What makes you confident that this experience will deliver the goods for you, that it'll be useful and value added? What, if any, concerns do you have? And then we ask the question, what can you do to take care of these concerns to make sure they don't get in your way during the practicum? And what can I do to help care for these concerns so they don't get in your way during the practicum? And finally, what else do you need to feel good about signing up? I am genuinely interested in hearing anything that we can do to make this an extraordinary experience for you. And the commitment level and the platform that Suraj and others have created for me, I'm just delighted with and really excited to be able to do this work with you and have you make a difference with your clients and in your work today and tomorrow. So this is just in a nutshell what this is in terms of the practicum. So there are 12 weekly 90-minute sessions. And there's going to be a video, an article, and at least one tool per session that you will receive. And we're going to set up in LinkedIn an ongoing conversation cafe. So this will be a place that you can drop in with questions, stories, comments, and I will be active in that every week and in between the sessions so that it becomes another part of our learning community. And the $199 is a suggested price. This is part of what Systems Thinking in Action and Temenos and Suraj have supported, which is a liberated pricing structure. So the $199 is a suggested price, and then there's a pay what you can based on the value that you believe you'll be receiving, and that is all linked to realtimestrategichange.com. You can sign up. There will be a direct link to the Systems Thinking in Action website, or in the materials that we send out after today as follow-up. There will also be a link to signing up there. So I know that we're approaching the end of our session, and I just open it up, Suraj, if there are any other comments and questions that people have for me or for Kay.
Yeah, there are a few questions, but what I think would be really useful, because you just have a minute left, is for you to clarify and talk about the 30-minute consultation offer, because I think I did not hear that.
Okay. So one of the things, thanks, Suraj. So one of the things that we're going to do is for people who sign up for the course, one, there will be a downloadable ebook of real-time strategic change, and that's a form of a textbook. The other is that there will be a 30-minute consultation, a private personal consultation with me that you can use before, during, or after the practicum. And that is in the spirit of making sure that you get the most value out of your experience and that I'm able to best support you in gaining that value. So those are two other pieces that we've included, and thanks, Suraj, for pointing those out. The other thing that I think we might do is if anybody has questions and can type them into the chat box in the follow-up materials that we send out, and in that Dropbox, Suraj, I can have a Q&A document where I can type answers to questions that have gone unanswered in some way during the session.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. We have about 15 seconds. Would you be open to me closing the conversation?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for dialing in from several parts of the world. I really appreciate your questions. And when you get a chance, please check our website, STIA+Temenos.com, and look for webinars and courses to get more information about courses by Jake Jacobs and others. I want to highlight that we have Meg Wheatley speaking on September 18th, and I look forward to hosting you all again for that webinar. Thank you very much. Goodbye, and see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Jake.
Thank you.
Hold on a minute while I stop the